Canoopsy here, and today let's take a look at Sony's two latest mid-range phones, the massive Xperia XA1 Ultra and the much smaller, much more reasonable XA1. Let's see which one is worth it and which one is the best for you. So starting off, the biggest difference here is the size of these phones. They're both your standard overall Sony boxy look, but here they have very thin side bezels unlike past Sony phones, so good job. I think the design does look really good, but there are many compromises here the closer you look, and the more you use these phones daily. First, those Sony corners. They create a really nice modern style, but they actually dig into your palms a lot, and they definitely do hurt. It's really not a pleasure to hold these phones for long periods of time, but they do feel quite solid in the hand. Also, this back matte plastic material is alright, but picks up so many fingerprints and smudges. And on my XA1 Ultra, there's a bit of a gap between the thin plastic layer and the internals, so when you push down on this plastic, it actually sinks in, showing just how thin the plastic layer actually is. Expect this plastic layer to get scratched and damaged quite easily, so a case or just some extreme caution is definitely advised. These phones are also not water resistant. Buttons are finally here in the right places and also feel very tactile. Especially on the XA1 Ultra, they have a great overall placement on such a big phone. And the two-stage shutter button is also here too, which is an amazing, excellent feature for smartphones. Both phones also have microSD and dual SIM card slots depending on the region. Now, the displays are the biggest overall differences. The XA1 has a 5-inch 720p display, while the Ultra has a massive 6-inch 1080p display plus the top and bottom bezels, making for a really big phone. The Ultra has the much better display here, most noticeably at first glance is the white balance. The XA1 has this weird, very warm look, while the Ultra has a cooler tone that's almost a bit too cool, but just okay. I do prefer the cooler tone, but that is personal preference. Sharpness is much better on the Ultra, and so is contrast, with the navigation bar almost blending into the bezel, but not really AMOLED or OLED level. Colors on each are good and very vibrant, but the Ultra does look better, and this also applies to viewing angles. Now, under the hood for specifications, these phones are very close, but the main difference here is an extra gig of RAM in the Ultra. I would have definitely preferred a Snapdragon processor in these phones, and maybe even having more flagship level specs on the Ultra, but performance is definitely alright. Opening and closing apps is pretty much on par with each of these phones, but the extra gig of RAM on the Ultra helps to handle multitasking and much more intensive things. These phones aren't going to be super powerful, as they're definitely still mid-range. And battery life on each is decent enough. The XA1 has a rather small 2300 mAh cell that equates to around a little under a day of usage. Probably not the best phone for a full day of usage for much more intensive users doing way more intensive things. The XA1 Ultra has a much bigger 2700 mAh cell, which can pretty much reach a full day of usage, but really not much more. But I really wish this phone had a much larger 3500 or 4000 mAh cell that really make it the ultimate battery warrior. And both phones of course have their own stamina modes through software to increase usage time, and charging through USB-C is very welcome here. Now in terms of software, both phones are on Android 7, and Sony software has always been pretty good overall, and here it's the same story. You have some nice icons, good transitions, and it's pretty close to stock. You still have a whole bunch of included bloatware and Sony apps that you can't delete but can only disable, but besides that, it's pretty good software overall. I covered software a bit more in depth in my Xperia XA1 review, so be sure to check that out if you want to know more about software, because it's pretty much the exact same story here, card on screen right now. But keep in mind, with the XA1 Ultra, you're not really getting any fancy optimizations or any special features for that really large display. Now sure, Android Nougat's multitasking is definitely much better on a larger display, but besides that, there's really no other optimizations. For example, everything just looks huge and blown up. And finally, the cameras. Both phones have a massive 23 megapixel sensor on the back, while the front, the XA1 Ultra has a 16 megapixel sensor and an LED flash, while the XA1 has an 8 megapixel sensor. Selfies do look pretty good, especially on the XA1 Ultra for sure. And for the back cameras, you get some pretty decent overall results for the pricing. Indoor and low light shots are alright, but can have a lot of grain, but they're definitely still usable. 1080p video recording is decent, with good colors and natural stabilization. It's not the best looking footage ever, but still it does the job quite well. Okay, so in summary, are these two mid-range Xperia phones really worth it at all? Well, the Xperia XA1 is a pretty decent overall mid-range Android phone. It's not perfect though, the display isn't the greatest, the battery life isn't really the greatest either, the design's kind of uninspired, but besides all of that, it's a pretty decent phone for the price of $250 US on Amazon right now, about that much. At this point, you're kind of inching into Moto G territory, which is definitely a bit of a better phone, especially for battery life. So if it needs to be a Sony phone, this is definitely a good option. But if you don't really care if it's Sony or not, the Moto G is something you should definitely consider. And the massive Xperia XA1 Ultra is definitely a very interesting case. I personally kind of like it because it reminds me of my days with the Z Ultra, which was a 6.4-inch display phone. Really ridiculous. But here it costs about $400 US, which is what Sony told me. But you can also find it for about $350 US in some areas, I think, as well. For that price, it's kind of worth it, but you're kind of getting into Moto Z territory, and you're getting into OnePlus 5 territory almost. For less than $100 more, you can get a flagship level phone. So what you get here is really a huge display and a pretty great camera. If those things really matter to you, then I guess it's worth it. In my personal opinion, the XA1 Ultra is definitely the better phone here, with a better overall display, better battery life, a gig more RAM, and just a better overall experience in my opinion, if you can deal with that screen size and the extra cost attached to it. And that's pretty much it for this video. Like it if you liked it, comment down below your thoughts on each of these phones, which one you personally prefer, if there's like a better phone in this price point you recommend, let people know in the comments as well. Subscribe, and thank you for watching.